who had to sacrifice themselves for the benefit of humanity. The blessed man will no longer be the man of faith, now he will be the wise man, and the idol of plaster, stone, or wood, will be replaced by the scientific idol and by the brain of man, the male. Religion has served as a mechanism of power, and to anesthetize the conscience, thereby avoiding suffering. Being able to distance oneself from it has been very beneficial for scientific development. However, on the other hand, this fact left man isolated, increasing his feeling of loneliness, doubt, uncertainty, since humans need a divine sustenance to give meaning to life, and successfully explain its mysterious existence. By not being able to totally separate himself from the religious aspects, the human transmuted them from magic, religion and theology to other knowledge that was gradually being built, under substitute forms, certain scientific features, which needed to be constantly refined because they were integrated into a certain measured by these religious forces of the past. The Western concept of progress was that of economic, capitalist progress. The material forces of the human have been the springs of progress, whereas the moral factors have remained on a lower plane. The inability to value the different, the belief in natural superiority over the savage and war as the means to achieve progress, led the world into chaos. Europe could not conceive that a superior civilization had existed before it, and if it were true, it would be best never to find its footprints. The existence of a man before the most technologically advanced European could not be accepted. From the paleontological theological perspective of Georges Cuvier, professor of comparative anatomy at the Museum of Natural History in Paris, and founder of modern vertebrate paleontology, he believed that in the past, a catastrophe could have buried a more developed man technologically than the European. This was an important factor in the departure of catastrophism from theology, and to be changed by the modernist school of geology, by the actualism of Charles Lyell and the quiet theory. Paleontology took up catastrophism again in the 20th century, but not an aqueous catastrophism, but a collision one. Regardless of whether Homer's account of the lost civilization of Atlantis by a great water catastrophe is true or not, which is not in dispute in this work, this possibility has been a problem for European claims of superiority. Europe perceived itself to be at the pinnacle of social evolution, self-sufficient, without the need to receive technological and scientific influence from any previous civilization. As the historical evolution had to be continuous, it could not have abrupt historical cuts, therefore, the European had reached the pinnacle of civilization, without having received any external influence. Generally, the psychological and social influence is not taken into account. The idea of a geological philosophy that had in the Europe of the 19th century, the change from catastrophism to actualism, since the former is intrinsically related to creationism. This implies that the passage from catastrophism to actualism in the field of geology and paleontology implies leaving behind the concept of creationism, and with it the religious principles that sustain it. The idea grew that the geology of the earth was no longer formed by a great sudden catastrophe of diluvial and divine origin, and that its formation did not originate a few thousand years ago as was thought. It was considered that their formation was produced by natural causes and that they happened gradually over millions of years. These changes gave rise to many scientific theories, produced a certain freedom and expansion by allowing different ways of seeing and thinking. However, on the other hand, it brought certain feelings of loneliness, separation, and uncertainty, because from these scientific changes the subject had to change the idea of a millenary supernatural creationism, to consider a gradual existence measured in millions of years. By exchanging one theory for another, the Genesis accounts of the flood and creation were questioned as historical facts and interpreted as mythical accounts. Eurocentric logic is closely related to racism, prejudice, hatred, pride, and the feeling of omnipotence. In the same way, anthropology, philosophy, sociology, psychology, politics, and law, among others, fields of knowledge, were somehow influenced by these ideas. Believing that intelligence is transmitted by inheritance, they then judged that the most advanced civilization, that is, the European one, inherited it from certain ancient peoples who carried that seed in themselves, and who historically gave birth to the European man. Now there is only the task of discovering that seed, that superior people from which European culture emerged. Hegel ranked the white, blonde man from Northern Europe over the other inferior existing races. Bagehot, like most intellectuals of his time, praised Greek culture as the bearer of that seed. Later Hitler believed he detected the superiority of the German Empire, in the Aryan race. Under these circumstances, nothing and no one will have the ability to modify an inherited and naturally imposed truth, a biological construction, alien to human will. It is then assumed that the European heritage must always be superior to all the others, it will be unalterable, because it has been mysteriously chosen by divinity, nature, predestination, and biology. However, in the same way as creationist theory, the logic of Greece and Republican Rome as the historical and inspiring source of 19th century Europe, and the fundamental foundation of values, aesthetics, democracy, inspiration, refinement, admiration lost its vigor more rapidly in the second half of the 19th century. After the Great Depression between 1875 and 1897, the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy were threatened to lose their privileges. The economy was affected, society rose to demand the right to vote, and anarchist groups emerged, which opposed political and economic power. Bagehot speaks of a rigid law. The lower peoples must voluntarily submit to the laws imposed by the higher peoples, or else they will act energetically to impose that rigid law but necessary for the growth of that lower people, and to the humanity. The superior people imposes progress, there is no other way to achieve this progress, only through this rigid law, which is nothing other than the Darwinian law of the survival of the fittest, provided from biology and applied at the political, social, and national level. In the same way that living beings are subject to certain hostile biological laws, by which a species must necessarily eliminate the others in order to survive, in the same way, there are laws that are manifested at the political level, by the which, a nation must necessarily eliminate the other nations if it wishes to survive, and at the same time manage to transform itself into a beacon for civilization. We can get to know which people have been naturally chosen to rule, knowing the victor, the people that have the greatest war power over the other. Seen from an analogical perspective, the Calvinist believed that it was possible to know who has been predestined by providence, knowing the economic prosperity of his acolytes. Prosperity was an indicator of salvation. While economic prosperity showed the Calvinist his eternal salvation, survival of the fittest taught Darwin the strict law of nature, while the rigid law for Bagehot was an indicator of human progress, eliminating one another. There is a political task that is naturally entrusted to the higher peoples. The term energy used to refer to military conquests, bears some relation to mechanical energy, typical of industrial advances. The European man-machine must produce conquests, subjugate peoples, obtain benefits. The energy of the machine to produce articles is related to the human war energy to plunder the conquered nations. The same man must become a war machine whose purpose is to annihilate and expand. Social Darwinism was accepted in Europe with speed and pleasure because it greatly stimulated the ego of Europeans, mainly the bourgeois class of the colonizing powers, especially the English bourgeoisie. For him it was believed that Europeans had reached the pinnacle of civilization, and that the savage could not resist contact with the civilized nations, perishing shortly after, succumbing to their presence until they were extinguished and disappeared. It was believed that all cultures prior to the 18th century were naturally inferior, stationary, passive, weaker, and more vigorous than the German Anglo-Saxon race. There was a prejudiced and monolithic concept of cultures, through the fallacy that all of them have the same characteristics among themselves, except when they are compared with Europe. Social Darwinism contains transmuted elements of a religious nature, already secularized, with biology and politics being their destinies. It was believed that wild peoples mysteriously could not resist the mere presence of the colonizing nations. This belief has a deep psychic relationship with the biblical accounts for which the pagans could not bear the Shekinah, the presence of God. The deadly presence of the nations of Europe in the face of the savage is related to the lethal presence of the Shekinah in the face of idolatry. Europe arrogates to itself a righteous, all-powerful redemptive mission, posits itself as the Shekinah, the divine presence on earth. Hegel affirmed that, the indigenous people, since the landing of the Europeans, have been perishing at the blow of European activity. These peoples of weak culture perish when they come into contact with peoples of higher culture. For his part, Bagehot, inspired by Hegel, stated that the savages in the first year of the Christian era were, to little difference, what in the 18th century of said era, and since they have withstood contact with civilized men of other times, while succumbing in ours, it follows in logical consequence that our race is, by all probabilities, stronger and more vigorous than that of the ancients. Bagehot, 1877, p. 65. The use of force was supposed to be natural, to impose the unity of the dispersed and isolated powers in order to found a state. To achieve progress it was essential to deploy a certain war capacity by subjugating and unifying the weak scattered peoples. The government had to enforce obedience, regardless of the means used to that end. The way to impose it was a secondary question, the important thing was to obtain it. Bagehot claimed that obedience can be obtained through the unity of the church and the state. In reality it does not matter if it is called church or state, there should be no difference between the king and the priest, since both must teach the same thing, as in the same way there will be no difference between legal penalties and spiritual penalties. The primitive man is weak and tender, and must be hardened by means of prohibitions through the unity of a state and through a distinguished class. Bagehot, 1877, p. 286. Bagehot's national unity meaning is a mechanical concept, imposed through the use of force by a distinguished class. Unity can only be achieved through the incorporation and oppression of dispersed peoples in order to strengthen nations in their Darwinian struggle. Everything that nations erect they must do to achieve that authoritarian unity. The homogeneous sense of cooperation, of fraternity, of solidarity, the construction of unity, of cooperative groups, of alliances, of cohesion bonds, the search for similarity between the various aspirations, has no value in itself, it has no value. Meaning to the theorists of the newly independent nations. Every effort is aimed at national strengthening, in order to avoid the powerless isolated man in order to resist the aggressions of other nations, prevail against them, subdue them, and incorporate them into that unity. All human manifestations since war, art, beauty, the love of meditation, the tendency to cultivate the faculties of the spirit, have as their main objective, to achieve that unifying end. We are supposed to eliminate another or else we will be eliminated. If you don't progress you run the risk of being left out. If we stop at this process we run the risk that a potential enemy will rise up against our stationary nation and take its place. The concept of progress is impregnated with Darwinian ideology, with the survival of the fittest transmuted from biology to politics, because, when a society lacks a solid cooperative alliance, a bond of cohesion, it is soon destroyed and defeated, by another well provided with the bond that the former lacks. The groups that win are generally worth much more than those that have been defeated, and in this way the primitive world was gradually perfected and its conditions improved. Bagehot, 1877, pages 285 to 292. Bagehot falls into inconsistency. For him and in a general sense for the colonialist logic, violence is desired and rejected simultaneously. It is accepted when it is exercised by civilized nations, and it is rejected when it becomes tyranny, that is, when it is exercised by savage peoples. In the superior nations, violence is necessary to achieve progress, whereas when it is applied by the savages it contributes to perpetuate superstition, custom, irrational, childish, rude and conservative behavior. There is a civilized violence and a savage violence. The first one leads us as a final destination to distinction, refined taste, good sense and prudence, instead savage violence leads us to statism. Those who progress will multiply, and those who reject this model of progress will necessarily succumb to the weapons of the enemy. These ideas have created an anxious psychological type, constantly on the alert, fearful, always prepared to face external danger, a possible imminent invasion and building enemies. The fear of being annihilated, of disappearing, of unfavorable and sudden changes, has been the force that stimulated compulsive work, imprinting on the new colonizing nations, a new concept of an accelerated and anxious time. This fear of loss from the political, economic, industrial plane, is the result of the transmutation of religious contents that previously produced different fears based on the spiritual and theological sphere. Since the Reformation, Protestantism had imposed this mistrust through the idea of the loss of conditional salvation, setting the stage for the formation of new nations. We have already seen that in Calvin's thought salvation was not won or lost, but that each one was born predestined for both damnation and salvation. In this case, compulsive labor was meant to stifle doubt, through success in business and in the economy as evidence of salvific predestination. In the case of Luther, a salvation that could be lost had to be sustained, through the constant evangelization of tireless and compulsive work from a religious dimension, in such a way that when the time came to leave this world, the divinity had to find to the faithful working in evangelization. If this process of compulsive work was stopped, there was a risk of losing salvation, in such a way that inaction revealed the failure of the believer as an evangelizer and transmitter of the truth. These fears of loss and religious statism, of laziness and apathy, were transmuted under the concept of stationary nations. Compulsive work went from a mandatory sacred character to being necessarily necessary for economic progress. Luther was troubled by intense doubt and uncertainty about his own salvation. In his commentary on the Book of Romans, 3:22 states the following: "Since we are not able to know whether we have every word of God or deny any, nor are we capable of knowing if we are really justified or saved. Therefore, whether through Calvinist predestination, or the Lutheran concept of salvation, Protestantism has inspired doubt, uncertainty, and insignificance, and with it, the fear of loss of what was obtained, a fear that later manifested itself under the political, social, and economic dimension, where the concept of progress is the result of transmutation, of the secularized manifestation that emerged from the concept of salvation. This salvation, in the same way as progress, must be defended at all costs against the attacks of potential enemies, spiritual or cosmic enemies, or national, political enemies. In the same way, Darwinian thought has significantly influenced the building modern nations. The company that dedicated itself to civilizing the three young Fuegians, named by the sailors of the Beagle as Fuegia Basket, Jemmy Button, and York Minster, was a failure. The young men were kidnapped and taken captive to England to educate them under the Victorian culture. They were Christianized, taught manners and the English language. This failure caused frustration and created some doubts about it. Referring to these experiences, Bagehot expresses the following: "Undoubtedly there will always be people who will prefer to remain strangers to the general march of humanity, like that savage who in his old age returned to the bosom of the tribe from which he was originally, saying that he had tasted the state of civilization for 40 years, and that the benefits it provided were not equal to the work it cost to acquire. But we must not pay attention to what those who are incapable of judging it say about civilization, nor what the defeated races say." Bagehot, 1877, p. 281. The concept of a European verifiable progress, which is supposed to be universal, unquestionable, is at the same time imposing, arrogant, intolerant, authoritarian, in such a way that all those who oppose this progress must be ignored, considered incapable of critical thought, and of belonging to the defeated races. The notion of European progress is monotheocentric in the sense that it is understood from only one dimension. It is unthinkable in the existence of different progress, intrinsically associating it with technology, in such a way that there is progress or not. The construction of modern and bourgeois states has been achieved through unification through force, and the use of their institutions as a means to enforce obedience and unity. The polygamy of the wild peoples contrasts sharply with the European and Christian ideal of the concept of family, and of monogamous marriage, and it is assumed that these wild peoples have no feeling of truth. However, monogamy customs and Christian morality required by Bagehot and the social context of the time, must be transformed into customs imposed as strengthening and unifying of culture, and therefore, it is understood that they should be forced as a means of defense. Moral: to eliminate the impudence of matriarchal, polygamic peoples, whose practices opposed to Christian truth and national unity weaken society in its natural struggle for the survival of the fittest. The formation of the states demanded the unification of the scattered peoples through the use of force and obedience regardless of the means of oppression employed, either through the church or the national government. All resistance to unification represents a threat to the construction of bourgeois nations. Therefore, polygamy, like polytheism, and other manifestations that exalt the diversity of thoughts, are dispersed manifestations that must necessarily be unified under the meaning of monogamy and monotheism. Patriarchal Monotheocentrism imposed the forced unification of heterogeneous aspects, of the dispersed, the diverse, the varied, the different, to transform it into homogeneous, undifferentiated, identical, and similar. The loss of the millenary cultural identity of our original nations occurred as a result of the birth of the bourgeois nations, and the imposition of civil obedience. Therefore, it is necessary to deconstruct the monotheocentric and patriarchal culture of the Eurocentered nations to restructure the culture of diversity. Everything that the Church and the nation established as moral and true had as its ultimate goal the imposition of power through unification. Everything we do in the present was supposed to be applied and useful to strengthen morality and obedience to the Church and the nation, with the aim of achieving unification, assimilation, and if necessary the elimination of the dispersed peoples to unify everything in a uniform state. The mental faculties, and intelligence, constitute a degree of evolution typical of the European man. The superiority of a people over others is achieved by sacrificing the present for a better future, that is, our whole lives must prepare to defeat the enemy in order to survive and subordinate their culture to ours. Phylogenetically, prehistoric man lacked this sacrifice, but the European could develop it because he was at the peak of evolution. This prehistoric man has never come to be located in that place. If he had acquired it at some point in history, he would not have lost it, he would not have gone back, since evolution is assumed to be linear, therefore it cannot be lost acquired skills. Therefore the savage never had acquired knowledge, because if they had they would not have lost it. According to these arrogant ideas, being the European the final result of human evolution, it has nothing to learn from any culture, since all of them respond to inferior phylogenetic realities. They are by nature savage, idolatrous, pagan, polygamous, polytheistic, are separated from the only truth. Morality and reason are the forces that must be imposed to overcome the enemy, and they constitute the present that must be sacrificed to ensure victories in struggles. Nature is cruel, the struggle between nations is an inevitable, necessary, and natural reality, therefore, the strongest must eliminate the weakest, strengthening the improvement of civilization. All a race must do is prepare to eliminate its competitor. Every sacrifice present is aimed at achieving this goal. The faculty of reason increases when passion diminishes. Reason tends to sacrifice the present to achieve a better future. On the other hand, passionate wild peoples will never be able to achieve such a sacrifice. Reason is a tool to achieve submission. On the other hand, passion does not submit, it rebels. War is the sacrifice of the present to achieve a better future, and whoever sacrifices himself will have a chance of survival. The concept of progress based on social Darwinism implies the dominance of the bourgeoisie and the European aristocracy over the lower social classes. Domination was necessary for the bourgeoisie to avoid having to work with their hands and to have more time to be able to dedicate themselves to the activities of the spirit. Bagehot concludes that progress is a process that takes place only in civilized nations. Let us remember that Bagehot's civilized nations are the same as those of Darwin and Hegel, and correspond only to the German Anglo-Saxon nations of the North, because even the nations of Southern Europe have been left out of history. The wild peoples are in a situation of permanent statism. Bagehot, 1877, p. 158. The European boasted of sacrificing the present to the future, which the wild peoples could not do. This idea of progress related to sacrifice has been transmuted from Christianity, by which the present life is sacrificed to achieve eternal life. This religious sacrifice, transmuted under political, social, economic, industrial dimensions, has a deep connection with death to the present life, with immediate pleasures, with compulsive work, investment, and the denial of enjoying what is acquired widely, characteristic of Protestant nations. That is why the inherited concept of civilization has a Protestant background, because it has left out the Catholic nations. For Bagehot, progress is not a constant and normal event. It does not manifest itself spontaneously in human society, therefore it is in vain to hope to always find it. We should not be surprised by its absence in a historical moment. He comes to the conclusion that the ancients, among them the Eastern peoples, had not the remotest idea of progress. They could not abstract from this idea or reject it because they never knew it, and they are refractory to progress. This statism has contributed so that ancient peoples have always been the same as they are today, stationary peoples. That is why savages are always in the same degree of culture. For them there is no progress, they have no place to build the building they could build, and they are far from possessing the materials of their culture. Only some nations of European origin march at the forefront of civilization, and as these nations are aware of what they do, hence they are inclined to believe that an irresistible force pushes them and determines this progressive march that they believe is inevitable, natural, eternal. We must finally agree that in historical times there has been very little progress, most of which has been made during the course of prehistoric times. Bagehot, 1877, pages 57 to 58. It was believed that only a few nations in Europe had been chosen by Providence to spread progress to the rest of humanity: England, Germany, France, and Holland, to which we add the influence of the United States. From these nations all the authors of our libraries emerge, whom we have internalized as a universal paradigm, in our universities and educational institutions. Bagehot tries to explain this problem, this huge difference between civilization and barbarism, following the reasoning of Darwinian natural selection. He interprets life as a struggle for survival, a conflict in which nations that are more powerful, stronger, and better must prevail over others. It states that, under the name of natural selection, they have become acquainted among us with the study of natural sciences, and like any great scientific conception, it tends to be extended and applied to solve problems that were not even suspected at the time they occurred. Hence this theory, which in its beginning only had a place in history of animals, it could later, changing its form, but, remaining the same in the background, apply it to the history of mankind in general. Bagehot, 1877, p.59. Bagehot celebrated the disappearance of the savage. It assumes that the war of civilized man will result in their extermination. Due to mysterious and unknown causes that did not occur in ancient times, the European managed to resist diseases, thanks to his natural biological superiority. On the other hand, the savage must necessarily perish little by little. He states that formerly the savage could bear contact with Roman citizens. This was possible because the savage remains stationary, and civilized peoples change and transform. Therefore, he comes to the conclusion that the resistance of civilized man to diseases is a potential that nature has given him in order to infect, make sick and exterminate the wild man, in the natural struggle for survival. In the writings of these authors, the word peace does not exist. Any manifestation of peace is interpreted as cowardice and inferiority, because it refuses the natural struggle for survival. The concept of progress in the inferior peoples was believed impossible, because the superior man, that is, the European, has not yet reached them, and the only way these peoples can progress is through of that other European. The mountainous, jungle, and inaccessible geography has been in many cases an obstacle for the conqueror, putting wild peoples out of his reach, and therefore progress. In such remote places there was no struggle, there could be no competition, since the superior races did not reach them, hence the inferior races have been able to continue to exist there without true cohesion bonds, and therefore weak and powerless to fight. Bagehot, 1877, p. 72. Peace must manifest itself, when the savage is exterminated, and in this way, the superior peoples can impose progress there. When a powerful nation, Theodore Roosevelt affirmed, fears expansion and renounces it, it can ensure that its greatness and power are nearing decline. Are we going to settle for being among the weak and the cowards when we are still in our first and glorious youth, at the dawn of our glorious manhood? No, and 1,000 times no. Hofstadter, 1969, p. 263. Progress manifests itself with each military conquest, with the conquering collectivity or swarms of conquerors. There is a direct relationship between warmongering and progress. Let us remember that Darwin, Spencer, and Bagehot are English and that they lived the context of British colonialism, the First and Second Opium Wars, the British rule in India, and the Victorian era. They justify the hostility of the Englishman, extolling the natural superiority over other nations. We recognize, of course, that the spirit of the Father is found in one way or another in the body of the Son. This quid ignotum that is transmitted by inheritance from the Father to the Son, is influenced more than by any other cause, by custom, and nothing more probable than the formation of a fixed type over time, which will be perpetuated by means of the action of the indicated causes, as long as they act without hindrance. Bagehot, 1877, p. 148. For Bagehot, a body, that of the Son, contains the spirit that inhabits another body, that of the Father, and, according to him, although he affirms that it is through inheritance, the way in which it is transmitted from one body to another, this process remains unknown. For Bagehot it is a mystery. Custom is the vehicle by which inherited human activity spreads. The author does not refer to the spirit from a theological point of view, however, if we analyze this expression, the body of the Son contains the spirit of the Father, we find a theological analogy by transmutation. The body of the Son contains the spirit of his Father. I leave my spirit in your hands. This unconscious analogy mentioned by the author, makes me consider the following. Said analogy unconsciously states the relationship and transmutational grading of theological aspects into biological and political concepts. His statements are not a simple casual comparison, they contain theological elements already unrecognizable as such and distorted. The unity between Father and Son is found in the doctrine of the Trinity. In the ideas of Bagehot, and of Spencer, politics contains interwoven theological elements already transmuted and unrecognizable as theological due to the process of historical and unconscious deformation. It is necessarily the body of the man that receives the spirit of the Father. In such a way that the male not only receives the titles of the Father, the material inheritance, he also receives, according to Bagehot and social Darwinism, the biological inheritance of the Father. In Jewish custom, from which Christianity derives, it is the father's first male child who receives 2 parts of the inheritance, while the other children receive only 1 part. Deuteronomy, 21-15. The firstborn is special because all the first, and everything first, is loved, is pleasing in the eyes of the Jewish monotheistic divinity. This God demands, orders under penalty of punishment, that the first thing should be offered for him, the first fruits, the first animal of the flock, and the first male child, provided that this is the eldest child. This first child has to be male and not female, in the Jewish halacha, and in a broad sense in the different monotheistic typologies, the representation of the divinity is related to the male. The monotheistic God is strongly related to the masculine aspects. We can affirm that monotheistic typologies are structurally pyramidal because the male is the head of his family, but above his head there is another head, that of a monotheocentric, patriarchal God, perceived as masculine. The firstborn male child, to receive the inheritance of privilege, must be recognized by another male, that is, by his father, and this must be recognized by another superior male manifestation of divine nature. The concept of biological inheritance has been influenced by the logic of inheritance and patriarchal primogeniture that Christianity has inherited from Judaism. By an inexplicable design, Providence has decided to grant the man, and not the woman, unless she has no brothers, like the story of the daughters of Selofhad, Numbers 27, 1-11, the right to receive the inheritance, and therefore, Bagehot has reacted unconsciously under the certainty that in the same way, the intellectual capacity is the exclusive possession of the man, and as such, it has to pass biologically from the father to the son and not to the woman. The concept of the monotheocentric primogeniture has left unconscious traces in the thought of the West. Later we will see in more detail, the psychic influence of these monotheistic religious typologies and their influence on Western civilization, establishing a comparison with the psychological structure of polytheism. This thought relates the ideas of social Darwinism with the male, with the patriarchy, with the man, since it is not the body of the woman the means of inheritance, but the body of the man. It is assumed that only through muscular strength, and virile vigor, can battles be won. Therefore, the material or biological components inherited by the male body and not inherited by the female body, are transformed into the necessary weapons to subjugate the enemies, and impose the influence of civilization. The origin of modern Eurocentered nations is patriarchal in nature, because they have inherited the spirit of the father, without which progress could not take place. To achieve this progress, it is necessary to subjugate the lower peoples, static, and only the virile impetus of civilized man will be able to carry it out. According to the author, imitation and the tendency to preserve habitual customs, give invaluable results. They transcend the physical order and act as constant forces, from generation to generation. That tendency to the continuation that human customs have is developing in the meantime. There is nothing to stop it. The arrest may be caused by natural selection, by the conquest of one people over another. In these ideas certain compulsive fears of suffering an evolutionary setback or a counter-evolution are expressed. That is to say, in any case that it is decided to renounce the warlike action, to establish peace, it will be renouncing at the same time, the struggle for survival. In such a way that if the vitality that keeps the warlike and virile action alive, through which the inferior peoples is submitted, is extinguished, there is a risk of being subjected by them and of definitively losing the hegemony achieved. Therefore, it is inevitable to stop in this ambitious pursuit, because the arrest of these military forces will have as a consequence the lethal reply of the perpetual enemy. The fear of attack as a response to the projection of hatred, generates a constant situation of threat and fears of retaliation. These ideas produce a situation of permanent anxiety, mobility, action, insecurity, fear, suspicion, living in a continuous state of alert, always on guard, awakens intrigues, mistrust, musings, doubts, and uncertainties. But despite this, it was supposed that to give up this bellicose, destructive, and expansionist impulse that expresses the progress of man is equivalent to succumbing to the forces of a weaker enemy, and having to regress to a period of obscurantism. Scientific thought of the time built evidence, relying on various sources in order to demonstrate what they really wanted to believe. It was a matter of adjusting reality to wishes, starting from a flimsy foundation, the result of which is to wait for the collapse of a whole building of convictions. We believe in our own fantasies, desires, and rationalizations, and based on this, theories are built. Our convictions can be inhabited by a blind belief, driven by unconscious, irrational forces, which place the oppressed as superficial spirits, who do not understand the most obvious facts of human nature. According to the thinking of the bourgeoisie, the savage, you have a weak intelligence, has great passions, emotions, and impulses. These passions are related to a weak intelligence. The greater the passion, the lower the intelligence. In the Victorian era, sexual passion had to be restrained by being construed as impudent. In the same way, spontaneity should be suppressed by mechanical, studied, and careful relationships so as not to produce social rejection. This instituted a way of differentiating themselves from the non-European passionate and savage peoples that were being conquered. He prefers the fleeting enjoyment of a weak, trivial, pleasure to quiet and lasting enjoyment. He is unable to sacrifice the present for the future. Has a very rudimentary and imperfect moral sense. Lacks complicated habit. He is circumspect and calculating. From a Eurocentric and universal point of view, wild peoples were judged to be passive and static. This bourgeois sacrifice of the present to arrive at a better future consists of saving, investment, and reinvestment, to achieve technological development, without which it would be impossible to subjugate other peoples. Through this sacrifice, a warlike advantage can be obtained in this struggle of the nations. According to this, if a nation is capable of making this sacrifice, then a single Australian tribe would have dominated all of Australia as easily as the English have conquered it in our days. Suppose a race of Scots with a circumspect and calculating spirit, suppose them as ignorant as the Australians, they would undoubtedly have subdued the region from Torres to Base. No matter how desperate the resistance of the Australians, they would have seized the entire territory by themselves. Bagehot, 1877, p. 158. The animal cannot sacrifice the present for a better future, it is only instinctively driven to satisfy its momentary needs. In the same way, a primitive people, by being phylogenetically closer to animal nature, is likewise incapable of sacrificing the present. According to this, and from a Eurocentric perspective, it was believed that India, being a passive and primitive civilization, has allowed a few British to defeat millions of Indians. The authoritarian character conceives weakness, defenselessness, and even the search for peace as synonyms of inferiority, cowardice, passivity. Therefore he has to experience deep contempt and hatred for weakness and helplessness. Being on a lower phylogenetic scale than that of Europe, made up of man, white, Christian, civilized and industrialized, the morality of the savages is considered imperfect and rudimentary in the same way as their reason, which allows them to be easily colonized. This intellectual faculty of the superior peoples is intrinsically related to that high moral capable of sacrificing the present. This high morale is related to complex intellectual issues. Furthermore, we have the right to suppose that the various races inhabiting that world at that time had not lost, once the most useful of the intellectual faculties had been obtained, the one that should best ensure their victory in the incessant struggles that men have always sustained among themselves, and against the elements and the various beings of nature since they exist, nor can we suppose they had abandoned the customs that in historical times have preeminence over all others and ensure victory in struggles. We can be sure that the morality of prehistoric man was as imperfect and as rudimentary as his reason. We can apply to morality this high faculty that allows us to be masters of our actions when we said of the aptitude of the sacrifice of the present for the future for important reasons. Both faculties, and especially that of obeying a high morality, are closely linked to very complex intellectual conceptions whose existence we cannot suppose among those men who did not know how to count beyond 5, whose forms of expression and whose means of language were simple and rude, who did not know how to read or write, and using a phrase as energetic as it was precise, they lacked pots and pots, who knew how to make fire, but did not know anything else, and whose rule over nature did not go beyond here. Bagehot, 1877, p. 159. Society projected its fears, hatred, on strange peoples, awarding them the same qualities and affections. Due to this, all cultural manifestations other than the European one were seen as dangerous, disrespectful for human life, ignorant of family feelings, that rush to kill individuals, that hardly have feelings of the truth, who follow a terrible tradition, who have a greater tendency to use lies than to avoid it. Unable to value as legitimate the cultural customs of the conquered peoples, it was believed in the existence of a universal culture that could only be interpreted, under English and Victorian morals, as the only universal standard of measurement. This logic has a warlike and military root. There was a firm conviction that the monogamic family tended to unify the dispersed, the fundamental basis of the struggle for survival, and in doing so, through unifying and fortifying moral practices, they would endow the nations with a feeling of family to subjugate the pudendal, polygamic, and polytheistic nations, not unified, dispersed, morally disintegrated, and as consequently weaker. Therefore, The ideas of marriage are so vague and so weak that the expression of common marriage had to be invented to convey their union or marriage, in which all the women of the tribe are common to all the men of the same tribe but to them only. Today, if we consider in what way human societies have been narrowed, so to speak, they have been fortified with the love of the truth, with the affections of the family and the solidity of the bonds of marriage. If we recognize that such sentiments would ensure a swift, certain, and complete victory for the tribe that possessed them over the tribes devoid of them, we would begin to convince ourselves how implausible it is that the innumerable tribes scattered throughout the world had lost all the instruments of conquest, the more powerful at least, not to mention others. Bagehot, 1877, p. 160. Mathematics was given great importance, through which it was believed that it was possible to know the degree of intelligence. Through mathematics, the ability to count, it was believed to get to know the level of savagery of senile peoples. The greater the knowledge and mathematical mastery, the greater the social evolution and therefore the greater the capacity to subjugate the enemy. Mathematics and intellectual capacity are closely related to these truths about numbers, which are instinctive in nature. It is innate, that is, one is born with this quality. According to the ability to reason mathematically, it was intended to know the inherited intelligence of the subject. It must then be assumed that the European man, evolutionarily occupied the pinnacle of civilization, and is located at the highest point of the scale phylogenetics. Therefore, the animal instinct was gradually diminishing, until reaching the present where the European man occupies a superior position, and closer to human nature than any other culture on earth. The animal instinct served the wild man as help and protection to fight for survival, but that instinct had to gradually weaken as reason evolved. Reason has now become a more sophisticated weapon superior to instinct, allowing civilized nations to eliminate irrational peoples in the fight for survival. The influence of the patriarchy concealed the works of Johann Jacob Bachhofen and Morgan on matriarchal civilizations. The publication in the Spanish language took 125 years to come to light for the first time, after the date of its first German edition. Bachhofen died in 1887 in oblivion, without having contemplated the social value of his work. With all the material we have analyzed thus far, we can infer the causes of such concealment, and the mute put into these remarkable works. The same happens with the notable productions in our continent. What happens to the jobs that are done from this continent? Who is excluding them, and making them invisible? Why? Is it necessary for the knowledge of our continent to be validated from Europe or the United States in order to consider it valid? From a European perspective, from the patriarchal thought, and the Victorian social context, primitive man was thought of as a being of licentious customs, without moral sense, and as proof of this, scarce and imprecise data were used. Anthropological of travelers, to confirm what they wanted to believe. This deep disregard for matriarchal societies made it possible to believe that. Considering the matter under the moral aspect, we know that the prehistoric age was certainly a time of licentious customs, and the proof is that the kinship was only known by women, as is the case even among the most backward savages. Motherhood, it has been said, is an incontestable fact. Paternity can be doubtful. If these expressions are not very delicate, on the other hand they perfectly indicate the kinship of the inferior human societies. Bagehot, 1877, p. 162. There was an intrinsic relationship between backward and savage peoples with matriarchy, and European civilized nations with patriarchy. The tendency to patriarchy is based on power, androcentrism, which is essential to raise warrior men, since without them progress and civilization would be impossible. These forces rest on the warlike potential of the dominant nations. It is necessary for the man to be brought up under domestic despotism. The general and complete absence of a useful force, of a power necessary for war, is the best proof that prehistoric men did not possess it. Given this axiom, we can apply it also, and in a palpable and evident way, to the marriage of primitive races. A family formed with close ties is the best seed of a warlike nation. In a Roman family, children from birth were brought up under a domestic despotism that wonderfully prepared them to later submit to military discipline, military instruction, or rather, military despotism. They were ready to obey their generals, because they were used to doing the same with their parents, and if they triumphed over the whole world in their manhood, it was because from their childhood they were educated at home for it within the family, where tradition or passion for courage was fortified by the custom of an inflexible order. None of this could take place in these groupings, where very loose ties brought together the individuals of a family. If those groupings deserve this name, none of this could happen where the father's authority was null, and his personality was often uncertain, where filiation was not determined by paternity, and where property does not come from the father, since this property passes only to those who are certainly united by blood ties, that is, to their sisters' children. A nation without close relations between its various groupings or between its individuals, which does not recognize paternity as a legal kinship bond, will be immediately defeated as an incoherent group, as it is put in conflict with another nation whose organization rests on the principle of custody. Bagehot, 1877, p. 170. If nature is cruel, if we really are living a constant war for survival, if it really is so, then we must arm ourselves to eliminate the enemy beforehand, before he does it with us. Bagehot admired the warlike and expansionist capacity of the Roman Empire, and his wish was to be able to rebuild that power again. To the extent that the child obeyed this domestic despotism, in the same way he would also obey his generals. That is why patriarchy is necessary. Patriarchal domestic despotism is essential for war preparation and militarism. On the other hand, in matrilineal societies, this so necessary family despotism will not be present because the father's authority is null and therefore the war capacity of these societies will be too. For social Darwinism, it is the son's body that receives the father's spirit as an inheritance. Therefore, without war capacity, progress could not exist since it is linked to this capacity. Due to this, matriarchal societies, and therefore women will also are useless because they do not produce men fit for war, since the war inheritance is described from the body of the father to the body of the male child. Due to its Eurocentric worldview, and its social context, Bagehot falls into the same error in believing that all cultural manifestations are violent, and that the human being himself is necessarily violent and bad by nature. Love, freedom, solidarity, women's liberation, peace, have no value in themselves nor can they be found by themselves since they owe their existence thanks to a previous period of wars that gave them their reason for being. Bagehot believed in a primitive age of mankind period that he called the age of strife in which the superior nations have defeated the inferior nations, the strongest over the weakest. This age had a marked tendency towards progress but uncertain, where the virtues and habits of war were perfected and developed. Later, this situation changed, in such a way that the development of the war was no longer favored. This virtue and habits of war were changing and manifesting themselves under another utility and effects, abandoning the virtues of the past. Respect for the law is a virtue of war to discipline nations in ancient times. This respect for the law, the indispensable element, has not disappeared, and owes its existence and virtue to war. The virtues and harmony of order, progress, explain success. These concepts that appear in our books and publications, contain a transmuted, historical, military, and colonialist meaning. The concept of order, orderly, homogeneous, uniformity, progress, duty, competition, success, discipline, disciplined, contains certain deformed remains from expansionist and militaristic forces. This progress is strongly related to the sense of competition, struggle, and survival of the fittest. Bagehot concludes that the majority of the world's population is in conditions of backwardness and only a small civilized minority geographically located north of the Pyrenees has the mission of carrying forward the progress of humanity by fighting, destroying and assimilating that uncivil majority. The progress will then arise from the struggle of races, from war, from the imposition of the strongest on the weakest. However, these warlike forces are taking other more civilized forms of expansion, and manipulation through economic competition, good treatment, and the sweetening of customs. The woman's body is wanted and excluded simultaneously. Sexually wanted, but excluded for war. This implies that women do not contribute to the development of progress, since this can only be carried out through manly qualities, and the use of the strength of warrior men. For Bagehot, war produces and fortifies certain virtues that he calls preliminaries, such as courage, sincerity, the spirit of obedience, the habit of discipline, fundamental qualities that ensure the military dominance of one nation over the others. The means do not matter how these qualities have been acquired, the important thing is to obtain them in order to compete with a greater advantage. Thanks to war, nations have embraced these virtues, while destroying opposing vices. These virtues are characteristics of the man, and not of the woman. Since it is precisely the man who, through his strength, skill, courage, marches forward in history, carrying the banner of progress. Victory spreads courage, and rude shock, encounter, the combination of manly qualities, integrity, firmness, and serenity of mind. Courage casts baseness and narrow-mindedness out of the world. Bagehot, 1877, p. 104. On the other hand, religious evolution had to leave behind the harmful idea of superstition, which could lead the nation towards military defeat. For this reason, superstition was rejected and conceived as typical of the inferior peoples. Superstition is seen as a military problem, since a nation that fails to overcome these irrational ideas could be at the mercy of a nation in the same conditions but that was not dominated by these superstitious omens. History offers us many cases of armies that have been defeated by the fear of an eclipse, that have motivated, and delayed the adoption of necessary measures. Bagehot, 1877, p. 182. We have already seen the importance that patriarchy has given to law, order, progress, civilization, the male, the muscular strength, the one who commands, the superior being, be smarter, passively submit to a higher authority, and at the same time submit to a weaker one. According to social Darwinism, as we go down the phylogenetic ladder, the presence of the leader tends to disappear among the more inferior animals. Taking into account the concept of human linear evolution, it was concluded that primitive man had no leaders to obey, and that this custom came much later, as societies evolved. Therefore, matriarchal societies are seen as more primitive and imperfect than patriarchal societies because, according to the logic of the natural, biological obligation of the existence of an imposing and unifying leader, it is assumed that these societies are phylogenetically closer of the animal kingdom. According to patriarchal thought, a society will not be able to survive without a boss who imposes his dominion, and if it is possible that this dominion is imposed by force, it is better. For humanity to progress, according to Bagehot's sociological interpretation, a unified and unifying power must be established through coercion, to subsequently achieve the submission of national customs and customs to this already unified power. Nations need an authority that imposes a fixed rule of life in order to foresee the future. In such a way that the momentary sacrifice imposed through coercion, of the more or less violent but temporary pleasure of the future, which is more lasting, becomes necessary. That is, momentary pleasure must be sacrificed to find due reward in future enjoyment. Animals want only the sudden satisfaction of their instinctual impulses, but this satisfaction may be delayed in the higher races since they are in a higher stage of development. Although it is true that we must often sacrifice the present to achieve a better future, this decision must be self-imposed, it must occur from inside, from the human will itself and not from outside through coercion in order to achieve forced national unification. According to Bagehot, the primitive legislation was established by superstitions. Rights, they represent the most important object that the most primitive legislations set out to achieve. Common property of the group, against private property. The group governed by a chief. Imitation and its contagious effect on the wild is more intense because it is phylogenetically related to the animal kingdom. Taboos, prohibitions. The process that led to civilization was understood as a series of steps difficult to take, especially the first. It meant a great benefit to civilization. The one that the victors could introduce culture among the defeated in a prompt and effective way. The experience we have of the English in India proves to us, at least, that a very civilized race cannot exert its salutary influence in a prompt manner on an inferior race, for the very difference that subsists between them. The two races are too far apart, and it is not the writings and conditions of superiority of the better, which the lower admires. The usual language is not the same for one as for the other. The individual with better conditions cannot be a model for those who have inferior conditions. He cannot, on the other hand, model himself under a civilizing foot, even if he wants to, and he would not want it even if he could. In this way, both races have lived for a long time,